Hi, and welcome to my reading of the RSH publication, Scotland in the Union. It is a short synopsis of our previously published book, The Treaty of Union Articles. It's only 3 chapters long, so it's very small, very succinct, and this is part 3, Thoughts of Home Rule. We're entering the 19th century now to find out what the pro-unionists in Scotland felt should be done to make the union a little bit more equal and a little bit more what they had signed up for, despite it not being the federal union that they had wanted. So let's see how they try to rectify this. Thoughts of Home Rule. In 1801, Ireland joined in its own union with Great Britain. This gave Scots something with which to compare their own union with England. Barely 40 years had passed before Irish calls for Home Rule and to repeal their own union came thick and fast. In 1838 we have a remarkable article entitled Repeal of the Union, Necessity of Local Legislation, wherein it was shown grievances were coming to a head. No one, we imagine, will be so absurd as to pretend that the affairs of Scotland can be as efficiently managed by a legislative body sitting hundreds of miles from her territory, and having the interests of an empire dispersed over the whole face of the earth, and containing more than 100 millions of beings to attend to as by a parliament meeting in Edinburgh. The expense at present necessarily incurred for a road, a harbour, or a railway bill for Scotland is intolerable. Then all matters relative to Scotland are slurred over in the reports of the debates. First, because the reporters think a Scotch bill, though vitally affecting Scotland, is of no public importance. Secondly, because they cannot intelligibly report what they in general do not understand. And third, because Scotch business is generally put off till past midnight, an hour at which, except on extraordinary occasions, the reporters, by a well-organised combination, Whig, Tory and Radical reporters agreeing in this point, retire from their labour. The consequence is that there is hardly a measure, however important, affecting Scotland, of the grounds for passing which her population are duly informed. What is meant by a repeal of the union with Ireland we do not exactly understand, but if all that is intended is that the Irish should have the management of their own exclusive concerns, we heartily wish them success, and we hope that when the people of Scotland shall see the necessity of a legislature in Edinburgh, the Irish will assist them in obtaining it. That's from W.J. O'Neill Daunt, Home Rule, the Scottish Union, letter from Mr. Daunt in the Dublin Weekly Nation, Saturday the 25th of November 1871. In 1853 was the formation of the National Association for the Vindication of Scottish Rights in order to obtain the representation Scotland deserved in Parliament, an end to centralisation, etc. This association was determined that Scotland may not be any longer treated as a mere province, a sort of larger Yorkshire appended to England. As taken from the National Association for the Vindication of Scottish Rights in the Caledonian Mercury, Thursday the 14th of July 1853. The English members of the British Parliament had had 150 years to show an intention of treating Scotland as the equal partner to the Treaty of Union she was, and had failed to do so, and had in fact gone out of their way to show the disdain they felt for the Scots, their country and their rights. Many of the calamities following on the Union had much encouragement if they did not spring soon that haughty English nature which would not condescend to sympathise in or even know the peculiarities of their new fellow countrymen. The pervading historical character of the events immediately following the Union is that English statesmen, had they desired to alienate Scotland and create a premature revulsion against the Union, could not have pursued a course better adapted to such an end. The position of the countries demanded a delicate and cautious policy. Scotland had to go through the immediate perceptible evils of a departed nationality, a decaying retail trade and increased taxation. The countervailing benefits from extended enterprise lay in the future. A paternal government would, on such an occasion, have carefully avoided everything that irritated national pride or prejudices, and seemed, however slightly, to sacrifice the interests or independence of the one country to the other. But in almost every one of the changes just enumerated, the offensive act was offensively done, and the country was ever reminded that she was in the hands of ungenial and uninterested, if not hostile, strangers. From the Edinburgh Review, October 1854, the article Britain's History of Scotland from 1689 to 1748. That's from W.J. O'Neill Daunt's Home Rule, the Scottish Union, letter from Mr. Daunt, Dublin Weekly Nation, Saturday the 25th of October 1871. In the latter half of the 19th century, an inheritance case of Or Ewing had been taken to the English courts when it rightly should have remained in Scotland. It was generally acknowledged that it was due to the amount of money that was in question that had attracted the attention of the English courts to it. This caused a huge amount of discussion in the press with regards English jurisdiction over Scots and those resident in Scotland. An article appeared in the Scotsman that gave a suggestion as to why English lawyers felt they had any jurisdiction in Scotland. In 1875, an English legal professor, John Indermer, had written an English law student's textbook that states, "Jurisdiction over Scotland acquired by the Articles of Union with Scotland, ratified and confirmed by the statute in the reign of James I." But this article goes on to mention that Mr. Justice Blackstone says, "The municipal or common laws of England are, generally speaking, of no force or validity in Scotland." That's from Suum Queque, English Ideas of International Law, Scotsman, Tuesday the 4th of March, 1884. Charles Waddy became super prolific at this time with his correspondence to the papers under his pseudonym Thistledown. He writes to the Scotsman, "There are very few Scotsmen who have read your article in the Or Ewing case this morning, but must feel grateful to you. In the rather dreary outlook for our national independence, it is no small comfort to see our leading journal standing up so manfully for the rights of our country. If you will pardon me saying a few words on the subject, I will feel obliged. It seems to me that Scotsmen who go to London to defend cases brought against them by Englishmen commit a grave error of judgment. In the 19th article of the Treaty of Union are these words, 'and that no causes in Scotland be cognoscible by the Court of Chancery, Queen's Bench, Common Pleas, or any other court in Westminster Hall, and that the said courts, or any other of the like nature after the Union, shall have no power to cognose, review, or alter the acts or sentences of the judicature within Scotland, or stop the execution of the same. The Lord Chancellor of England has done what is here distinctly forbidden, but, in the name of common sense, why do Scotsmen not seek the protection of their own courts? No act of the British Parliament can set aside their rights. They are secured to them by solemn engagement, and it would be an act of treason to the Constitution to try and set them aside." That's taken from Thistledown, English Jurisdiction in Scottish Cases, Scotsman, Tuesday the 4th of December, 1883. The determined efforts of centralisation, the bid to have Scotland become a province of England, was never-ending battle for those who stood against it. The Reverend David Macrae of Dundee made great strides in subverting this attempt. When it came to Scottish publishers publishing Scottish history books for Scottish schools, with Britain and Britain replaced with England and English, he really let loose, holding meetings with the Dundee School Board in a strong attempt to prevent this subversion of Scotland's history and her place within the Union. He had them adapt the following motion: that the board regrets to find in so many of the school histories submitted for its inspection, even those issued by Scottish publishers, that the terms England and English are so often used, as if they were proper equivalents for the terms Britain and British, that the board appoints a committee to correspond on this subject with the publishers, especially of the books used in its own schools, and to confer with the teachers under the board as to the best means of having this objectionable and blundering misuse of our national names corrected. That's taken from England versus Britain, the Dundee Courier, Tuesday the 8th of January 1884. An example of this is given. In reference to a recently published school history, he says, "The Union is recorded in the middle of the book, as if it were a mere incident in the history of England, which remains England with Scotland taken in. The lion and the lamb lie down together, but the lamb is inside of the lion. The absurdity of the thing is all the greater that the book records the fact that the two kingdoms were united into one under the name of Great Britain, yet the very name which it says they were united under is forthwith set aside, and the name of England used almost continually instead. The British throne is called the English throne, the British fleet is the English fleet. The war between Britain and the United States in 1812 is described as a war between the States and England. In the Battle of Waterloo we hear only of English soldiers, and in the Afghan war the troops are English troops, and the army the English army. It was not the British and French that fought side by side in the Crimean War, but, according to this history, the English and French. The settlement of the Alabama claim is described as an event unique in English history, and Mr. Gladstone is not the British Premier, but the Prime Minister of England. And this outrage on our national name and history, this practical turning of Scotland into a mere county or district of England, is found in histories issued by Scottish publishers for use in Scottish schools. It wasn't just in speeches and the media that this subversion was taking place, however. It was found that the British Parliament were passing international treaties with England and English in place of Britain and British, leaving those who noticed to wonder if Scotland were therefore legally a part of such treaties. Why had Scotland made it an indispensable condition to union with England that the united name should be not England, but Great Britain? Why did she postpone the union until England accepted this condition? Because it enshrined a great historic truth and put England's seal to the fact that, after centuries of conflict, Scotland remained unconquered and entered the Union a free and independent nation to form, along with England, a still larger nationality under the name of Great Britain. Encouraged by the cowardly acquiescence of the Scottish members of Parliament, the government had introduced the name of England into the New Hebrides and Burma treaties, instead of the term required by the treaties of union between England and Scotland, and between Great Britain and Ireland. It was high time that Scotland looked to her rights. That's taken from the Reverend David McCrae on Scottish national rights, the Dundee Evening Telegraph, Thursday the 2nd of October, 1890. Reverend McCrae also mentions another of these treaties at a meeting in the Kinnaird Hall, Dundee. That this meeting desires to thank Dr. Clark MP for Caithness and Mr. Hunter MP for West Aberdeen for calling attention in Parliament to the conduct of the present government in permitting a treaty with China to be negotiated under the name of England instead of Britain, in direct violation of the treaties of union between England and Scotland and between Great Britain and Ireland. That's taken from Sympathy with Ireland, the Dundee Evening Telegraph, Friday the 16th of September 1887, which goes to show just how common and pervasive this centralising tactic had become. William Burns was another of these staunch activists against centralisation. His many letters to offenders and news outlets seem to have an effect on those set on maintaining the practice of substituting, where possible, Britain and British for England and English. In one such letter to the Spectator newspaper, a frequent offender, he says, "You assure me you are innocent of any wish to swindle the Scotch out of their nationality, but you profess to be surrounded by difficulties. There are, you say, 3 nationalities in the Union, the English, Scots and Irish, and you create, for the nonce, a 4th one, the Welsh, or Taffies, as you are pleased to call them. In these circumstances you profess to have great difficulty in finding an appellation to cover the whole, and after figuring various combinations made ridiculous on purpose, you come to the conclusion that the simple remedy is to set aside history and geography, violate the Union treaties, and make England as the larger division stand for the whole." That's taken from William Burns, The Land Without a Name, Glasgow Morning Journal, Wednesday 24th of February 1864, which really goes to show how uncaring this outlet and others were of the insult they gave to any nationality other than that of the English. He gives some of the effects on Scotland of the Union, one of which was the clearances, and gives Home Rule as the solution. The Reverend Mr. McCrae said there were some people who thought ministers should not interfere in politics. They were to be quite free to deal with sinners of Bible times, but not with those in the present day. They must not say a word about those who turned pasture land into wilderness for sport, and drove the landless people into acts of violence to keep themselves, their wives, and their little ones from starvation. If that was their religion, they needed another. If that was Christianity, they needed to have Christianity born again into the spirit of Christ. Perhaps no nation of its size had more reason to be proud of its nationality than Scotland had. After emphatically protesting against the use and state of documents, school books, and public speeches of the words England and English for Britain and British should be used, as stipulated in the Treaty of Union, Mr. McCrae said the maintenance of the imperial names was indispensable to the maintenance of national honour and national rights. He strongly advocated Home Rule for Scotland. If Scotland had been managing her own affairs, we should not have seen half of the Highlands turned into deer forests. We should not have seen 300 square miles of country locked up for one man's sport. while the hardy population were forced to the verge of starvation or driven out of the country because, forsooth, there was no room for them there. If Scotland had been managing her own affairs, there never would have been a Crofter and Cotter question such as they had before them at present, or the question, had it arisen, would have been settled long since, with a regard more to justice and humanity than they were likely to see in its settlement under existing circumstances. That's taken from the Reverend David Macrae's Scottish Home Rule, Greenock Telegraph and Clyde Shipping Gazette, Thursday the 15th of December 1887. An incident which inspired him to write again to the Glasgow Herald was Colonel McMurdo's address to the Scottish Volunteers. Colonel McMurdo, by name and reputation, is a Scotsman. He was addressing an army of Scottish volunteers, Lowland and Highland, and he concluded a laudatory address, according to the Herald, as follows. It is a point that I have often remarked among the volunteers, especially of Scotland, that the pastors of the people are attached to the volunteer corps. There is seldom a review that I do not see the minister as chaplain of the corps marching past in its rear. There was once a time, a long time ago, when pastors assembled their armed congregations on these hillsides to protect their rights and liberties, but now the pastors of the people assembled on these hillsides with the volunteers of England. A voice, of Scotland, to show that they encourage the volunteers to maintain the institutions of the country, the integrity of the dominions, and the honour and safety of the Crown of England. Applause. You, Mr. Editor, and many of your readers are aware that for some years past I have maintained a protest against the growing practice of using the terms England and the English as representing the United Kingdom, its people and institutions, a protest founded upon the practice referred to being in violation of the Treaty of Union, and at the same time dishonouring to the people of Scotland, subversive of their historical traditions and associations, prejudicial to their position, political and social, and so injurious to their material interests. In support of this, I sometimes tried argument and in other times ridicule, and I cannot allow the opportunity of Colonel McMurdo's address to the so-called Volunteers of England to pass unnoticed. That's taken from William Burns, The Paisley Herald and Renfrewshire Advertiser, Saturday the 6th of August 1864. These efforts culminated in 1897 with the Monster Petition. More than 100,000 Scottish people of all ranks and classes, including several of the nobility, over 600 provosts and town councillors, and upwards of 50 members of Parliament, including the members for the Scottish universities, have now signed the Scottish People's Petition to the Queen, protesting against the misuse of our national names, such as is found, even in official documents, in direct and flagrant violation of the Treaty of Union. It is a monster petition, more than 3/4 of a mile in length. That's taken from Britain Not England to the Dundee Courier, Friday the 12th of November 1897. Those Scots who had taken an interest in the place their country held in the Union had investigated how Scotland stood financially, and the reports that came back were shocking. They showed by just how much Scotland was both overtaxed and underfunded by the British Parliament when compared to the financial affairs of England and Ireland. It is so difficult to grasp such enormous figures, or to conceive that our poor country can be robbed to the amount of 8 or 10 millions a year, that I may be allowed to quote from the report of a speech made by Dr. Clark, MP for Caithness at Dumfries on the 21st of August last. A few instances to show how our money was not spent in our country, how our own people were paid in a mean and miserly fashion, while everybody else, especially in Ireland, was paid in a free and generous way. The British Parliament voted this year 860,000 for law charges in England, 527,000 for Ireland, and 122,000 for Scotland. We had about 4 millions of a population against the Irish 4 3/4, but the law charges of Ireland were 4 times the amount of those for Scotland, although the difference in the population was very little, and they had also an Irish constabulary, which was merely an army in disguise, for which we pay 1.5 million. Local government in England cost the Imperial Exchequer £464,747, in Ireland £132,600, in Scotland only £9,500. Turning to the medical and scientific branch of local government, he found that they paid for medical superintendents in England £17,755, in Ireland £5,800, in Scotland £500. In fact, the only sum for medical superintendents in Scotland voted by the imperial government was £200 for Dr. Littlejohn, medical advisor of the Board of Supervision, and £300 to Dr. Husband, who takes charge of the vaccination department. While in Ireland, you had got one man with £1,200 a year and several men with £600 a year to assist him. There were thousands of preventable deaths taking place in Scotland which, had the Public Health Act been applied, never would have occurred. They pressed on government this year to give us something, and they gave us £15,000, but they gave it out of our own budget, out of our own local resources, whereas in England and Ireland they paid it out of the imperial taxes. In Ireland they paid half the salary of every medical officer of health and £15,000 for sanitary inspectors. In Scotland, not one penny. They had in England a Royal School of Science, and we voted every year for that school £16,000 for salaries and about £3,500 for scholarships and bursaries. We voted for the Geological Museum £20,573. Not a penny came to Scotland for such purposes. In Ireland they had a Royal College of Science in Dublin, to which they voted £7,000 a year, of which £800 was payable in scholarships. He had tried time after time to get a grant for the Watt Institution in Edinburgh and the West of Scotland Technical Institution in Glasgow, and it had always been refused. The government brought forward a vote of £15,000 for English and Scotch colleges, and how much of that vote did they think Scotland got? Not a single penny. When they rushed through the estimates at the end of the session, the only thing he could say was, "Well, I'm not going to discuss this, but I should advise the Chancellor of the Exchequer for accuracy to strike out Scotland altogether, for it is obtaining money under false pretences." Last year the excuse was that no Scotch school had applied. They sent down information to the colleges of Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester and other places, and they got some £3,000 apiece from this £15,000. This year the Scotch had applied, but no Scotch need apply, for they had not got a penny. He could go through a long list, pointing at things that in Scotland were defrayed out of local rates, and in Ireland and in England either wholly or in part from imperial taxation. In England, part of the cost of registration of births, deaths and marriages was paid from the imperial exchequer. Here, it was paid entirely from local rates. The same thing occurred with the inspection of certain schools and vagrant institutions, and the expenses of auditors of local boards were defrayed by imperial grant in England, and in Scotland from our own pockets. Taken from Harry Gow's Home Rule for Scotland, Financial Grievances, Scots Magazine, Sunday the 1st of March 1891. Charles Waddy sums it up in a fairly alarming way. In no year since the Union has there been any generosity shown to Scotland, but the numerical power of the English in Parliament has been used unsparingly to plunder the smaller people. It was only, however, after the rise of the prosperity of Scotland, which began with the first years of the present 19th century, and took its full flow since 1832, that the English Chancellor of the Exchequer reaped the full benefit of his attention to Scotland. We will take 3 decades as an illustration of the plundering we refer to. That is, from 1861 to 1891, 30 years in all. The first 10 years, that is, from 1861 to 1871, the average rate of taxation each year per head of population in Scotland was £2 11 shillings 5 1/4 pence, while the English taxation was only £2 9 shillings 4 1/2 pence, a difference of 2 shillings and 3/4 pence against Scotland, which in a population of 3,069,404 amounts to 316,532. This, in 10 years, comes to 3,165,320. From 1871 to 1881, the next decade, the taxation per head of population in Scotland was £2 12 shillings 6 1/4 pence, and in England £2 2 shillings 11 1/4 pence, or 9 shillings 7 pence more per head for Scotland than for England. This, in a population of 3,368,921, amount to £1,614,274, which in the 10 years amounts to £16,142,740. When we come to the year 1881, the first of the last decade, we find that while Scotland contributed per head of population £2, 5 shillings and 9 pence, England's share of public burdens was only £2, 2 shillings, 4 and a quarter pence, or 3 shillings, 4 and 3/4 pence less, which in a population of 3,745,485 amounts to £635,952, and in the 10 years amounts to £6,359,950. The figures are instructive, for in these 30 years of Scotland's prosperity, she has been compelled to pay no less a sum than £25,668,010 more than she was bound to contribute according to the standard of England. That's taken from Charles Waddy's How Scotland Lost Her Parliament, 1891, page 76 to 78. We can hardly believe things got better after oil was struck in the North Sea. It would be interesting to see the financial situation of Scotland laid bare and investigated as it was done at the end of the 19th century. As a tiny illustration of how nothing has changed, we still remember when Scotland's representative, Angus MacNeill, stood up in Westminster prior to the 2014 referendum on Scottish self-determination and asked, "A poll last week showed that 68% of Scots want oil revenues devolved to Scotland. Does the Prime Minister agree with 68% of Scots, or does he not?" In response to which he received howls of laughter and derision from the opposing Conservative Party, and the answer from then Prime Minister David Cameron, pausing occasionally to allow the hilarity of, "Well, if you ask a stupid question, you get a stupid answer." That comes from Fury is laughing Cameron brands Scots stupid, a video in Shawnee's World, 12th of August 2014, link accessed by myself on the 30th of the 1st last year, 2021. In 1894, Dr. MacGregor stood up in Parliament and asked, "Seeing the difficulty Scotchmen find in getting redress of their grievances in this House, may I ask the Lord Advocate whether he does not think the time has now come when Scotland might resume control of her own affairs?" That comes from Glasgow Herald, Friday the 5th of January 1894. He too received laughter and derision in response, with no answer returned to him on that occasion. How long do we keep continuing this farce of an equal union? What will it take to reclaim our rights and self-governance? That ends Scotland in the Union, and I hope you found it informative. All the links are down below for where you can read this online for free. Information I feel should be free. If you want a hard copy, I'll put links of that down below too. And that's us for this very short publication, and I thank you for joining me for my reading.